I am Brad Parks. I am a former reporter with the Star-Ledger in Newark.
Can you tell me a little bit about the plaque that is directly above us, as loudly as you possibly can?
The plaque above us is itself a testimony to civic involvement in the Newark riots. It came about as a result of what we called the Big Bad Committee. I think its actual formal name was probably the 40th Anniversary Commemoration Committee. No, we were the Big Bad Committee. And one of the things we realized is that nothing had happened to mark the place where the riots, the rebellion, the uprising, whatever you want to call it, actually began. And that this building that I have chosen to be standing in front of is in fact a historic place, and something should be done to mark that, to commemorate that. And people walking, you shouldn't be able to walk down this street in Newark and not know where you are. And so this plaque was very much about that effort. I'll read it just because the words were definitely, we fought over these words, and I shouldn't say fought over them, but we definitely chewed over them, and we gave them a lot of thought. So on this site on July 12th, 1967, there began a civil disturbance that took the lives of 26 people and forever changed our city. May this plaque serve as a symbol of our shared humanity and our commitment to seek justice and equality. Dedicated July 12th, 2007, by the citizens of Newark. Yeah, that plaque obviously tells a story, and a lot of the word choices in that plaque are very deliberate and were not done without great thought and without great consideration. And I think even the word choices say a lot about, again, we don't call it a riot. We call it a civil disturbance. That word choice is very meaningful. We talk about 26 people. Okay, now, believe it or not, even the fact that 26 people died has been contested at various points. And you will see reputable, like the New York Times has reported anywhere from 22 to 30, this is the New York Times, they ought to be getting it right. No, it was 26. Being able to really not just say these things, but get them in bronze. I mean, to be able to say, may this plaque serve as a symbol of our shared humanity. Like that this isn't just, hopefully, one side telling the story or one side claiming victory, or no, this is all of us together kind of remembering this event. And of course, our commitment to seek justice and equality. And hopefully that's why we remember things, is because we want to do it better the next time. So being able to talk about justice and equality is important. And of course the last line, dedicated July 12, 2007, by the citizens of Newark. So this wasn't just by the committee, this wasn't just by a group of people, no, this is everyone in Newark and everybody who comes into Newark.
Can you tell me a little bit about why you think it's so important to remember this event? I think some people have argued that, let sleeping dogs lie, or some wounds are too painful to kind of be stirred up, or some civic memories are best left to rest. Why do you think it's so important for us to commemorate? Why is it so important for us to remember?
I think Newark doesn't know where it is until Newark acknowledges where it's been. So it is important to remember and commemorate, not only because it's what happened, but because it tells us about where we're going. God, that's such a big question, Rosie. I kind of like, why do we... I myself, as a reporter who approached the disturbance as a newcomer, I didn't grow up in New Jersey, I didn't have grandparents who lived in Newark. I was really very fresh to it. But I'd been in Newark for a long time. I'd been in Newark for 10 years before I started doing reporting about the riots and what exactly happened during that summer of 1967. And I didn't truly understand Newark until I understood those events of 1967. And so if I feel that way, I think anybody else who wants to arrive at an understanding of where Newark is and what it is has to know what has been. it has to understand that, okay, the camera has me right in front of the 4th precinct, but across the street here, there are a bunch of new townhomes. And if you're just strolling down this street, you'd think, oh, there's just a bunch of nice new townhomes. Well, that site, that was where Hayes Homes stood, which was 6 buildings, 8 buildings, whatever it was, a public housing project. Thousands of people lived there, stacked on top of each other in these incredible high-rise buildings, and the things that went on in those buildings, and the lives that were lived, and in some ways the wonderful community that they were, but then also the promise that they had when they started, but then the degradation by the time they were finally torn down, and the failure they represented. I mean, unless you understand all that, how can you understand what having these townhomes there really means? So I think the riots are, they are without question the most important event in Newark's 20th century history. And so to understand Newark in the 21st century, I think you have to understand what happened in those 5 days of the 20th century, and how it continues to echo in this city.
Why do you think it's important for the city to have put up a bronze plaque? You mentioned the importance of these words being in bronze, compared to maybe private forms of remembrance in churches and synagogues, at home, schools. Why do you think it's so important to have a physical form that is so publicly viewable and available?
You know, I think it's important to have a nice big bronze plaque, because anybody walking along 17th Avenue in Newark can stop and look and pause. And that's meaningful to me. I mean, this is, I'm sitting here on a sidewalk in Newark. That's a public place. And I think we need to, it's important to mark our private places, but we have to mark our public places too, and we have to make it available for everyone. So it's not just, again, one person remembering something or one group remembering something. This plaque, this big, beautiful bronze plaque, is all of us. And here in a place where any school child walking along, any grandmother, any father, it doesn't matter who you are, you can see what we have chosen to remember, and I think that's meaningful.
Tell me how you were going to write a big piece about this. Right, so this event is not historically commemorated for the first 35 years. How are you?
Well, it had been. I mean, it had been.
Talk about it.
Okay, so the commemoration of the riots is an interesting study in itself, because it started off as something we couldn't talk about. Nobody wanted to. As a matter of fact, the first step that I did when I was writing this big piece for the Newark Star-Ledger about the riots was go back and look at what the paper had done in the past. And so I'm filing through microfilm and everything like that. And do you know what the Star-Ledger did on the first anniversary of the Newark riots? And mind you, newspapers love anniversary stories. Anniversary stories are like this irresistible thing to us, right? Anniversary stories are like the bowl of candy on someone's desk at 4 o'clock in the afternoon when you're kind of hungry. You can't resist them, right? And yet, on the first anniversary of the Newark riots, arguably the most significant event in Newark's 20th century history, the Newark Star-Ledger did nothing. On the second anniversary of the riots, the Newark Star-Ledger wrote nothing. On the 5th anniversary of the riots, the Newark Star-Ledger wrote nothing. It wasn't until the 10th anniversary that the paper of record of Newark, New Jersey could even acknowledge that this event had happened. For 10 years, it was too raw, it was too close, it was too painful, and even at the 10-year mark, mind you, it was mentioned, right? And it was, oh, don't get me wrong, we did reporting, but the reporting was always, how far have we come? So the riots were a touchstone, and it was all, where are we now versus where were we then? And the 20th anniversary and the 30th anniversary, it was the same thing. We didn't actually attempt to go back and say, hey, what actually happened here? And for the very reason that nobody wanted to talk about it. I mean, even when I was starting to do my reporting at the 40th anniversary, I got a lot of people who really were not in the mood to talk about this thing. I mean, it hurt that badly. It had been that painful. I mean, 26 people lost their lives. $10 million in property damage. A city turned into a national emblem of everything gone wrong with cities, right? I mean, this was a very painful thing. So it definitely, it took a long time for Newark to be able to even have a public conversation about this. And I think a big part of it was, I mean, when I think about the people I interviewed and the people who were really on the ground floor of the riot, a lot of them were in their 20s. They were in their 30s when it happened. They were young people, but suddenly 40 years passes and they're in their 60s and they're in their 70s and they're in their 80s, and they're in a mood a little bit to be a little more reflective about what has happened, and maybe it's not quite as close and it's not quite as raw, and Newark has changed so much since then, and so they finally do have that perspective. But even still, I can say, and I cannot tell you how many phone calls I placed to talk about, you know, started with the conversation, hey, tell me about what happened in July 1967 in Newark. And if I placed 200 phone calls, you know, probably 50 of them weren't returned. So there are still a lot of people who don't want to talk about this thing. So that gets around to the Big Bad Committee. The Big Bad Committee was in itself an incredible symbol of just how far Newark had come to be able to talk about this, because we really had an incredible swath of constituents in Newark represented. We had the arts community represented. We had the academic community represented. We had the law enforcement community represented. We had the schools represented. We had me, a humble little newspaper reporter. We had so many different viewpoints and so many different people who were at least willing to get in a room and say, hey, let's talk about this. What does it mean? What are we going to do? And kind of really come together in ways. Face it, Newark was not coming together in 1967. I mean, and that cannot be lost on any of us, that at least by 2007, we could all sit in a room together, and that was meaningful.
Who do you think your audience was? Like, who? It's really interesting to me because I interviewed Linda Epps, right? And I interviewed Max Herman, and I interviewed Clem and other people that were on this committee. And it's really interesting to me that for the 40th anniversary, like you said, newspapers love anniversaries.
Right.
You know, so you have people coming from Democracy Now! And NPR and all of these major outlets. And then the year after and 5 years after, outside of the People's Organization for Progress?
Larry Ham, God bless him. I hope you're getting Larry Ham.
Yeah.
Okay,
sure.
because Larry, you know, for whatever we've done, God bless Larry Ham and the People's Organizations for Progress, because yes, we made a big deal over the 40th anniversary, but they were out there for the 38th and the 41st and the 33rd, and they really kept the flame alive, for sure.
What do you think that says to us, that there was so much publicity and so much zeal around the 40th anniversary this year? Yeah,
no, I understand. Zeros are a big deal. I don't think you can read into any further than that. And I think the 50th will be a big deal as well. I sincerely hope you have your PhD by the time the 50th rolls around, Rosie. But you know, a 40th anniversary is a significant thing because there are still enough people around who lived the event, who can tell you what happened or what they remembered. And they're still in an age, I mean, we're losing the people on the front grounds of that disturbance every single day. And we're losing that living memory. And there's a big difference between a 40th anniversary even and a 50th anniversary in terms of the people who are going to be around. And so I think there was a sense at the 40th of, hey, you know, we've got to get this down now. You know, we've got to be able to tell our story now, because after a while, the people who can really give us a critical perspective, they're going to be gone. So I think that was definitely part of the impetus of it. You started talking about the audience for this. In terms of the audience I was thinking about, and I can only speak as one guy who was writing a series of newspaper articles, I know that the Star-Ledger had at that point a circulation of about 400,000, and that it was spread over all of northern New Jersey. But if you learn nothing else about New Jersey, it's that most of New Jersey has ties to Newark in one way or another. Everybody either was born here, or they had a grandmother who was born here, or they visited here. I mean, Newark has tentacles everywhere. So I was writing for those people who had that tie to Newark, whether they live there or some family member lived there or they've just visited there. They have that tie so they know the place a little bit, but they don't really understand what happened there. And they certainly, and maybe they've heard about the riot. I think the other thing that I was thinking of was, hey, a lot of people have grown up hearing about this event, but they could be 35, 40, 45 years old and not really have a clue beyond what grandma has told them about what actually happened here. So really being able to say, hey, this is what went down, you know, and being able to do it with the voices of people who actually saw it. And who were actually there and who actually could say, I mean, you want to talk hard work? Find someone who will admit to being a looter. And I felt I had to get that voice, right? You got to get, I mean, that was part of that riot, people looting. And so eventually I found some guy who had been arrested, because I had rolls of people who were arrested, and I found a guy who had been arrested. And this is the beautiful thing about 40 years. Had I asked him 40 days after he had been arrested, tell me about looting in the Newark riots, he would have hung up the phone. 40 years later, it's this youthful indiscretion. He laughed, he said, yeah, we broke into a liquor store, ha 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 ha. And it was kind of no big deal, and he could talk about it and admit to it, versus 40 days after, you can't do that.
Can you tell me a little bit about that experience of calling people and asking them to remember a time in their lives which for some was confusing, for others was terrifying? For many people, I know you mentioned that a lot of people that heard about the riots don't know what happened, but a lot of people that were in the city
in the riots
didn't know what happened either, which is, I think, one of the reasons why Clem pushes so many commemorative activities, so that way people can look at it through a historic lens to understand that people didn't leave, that you didn't have suburbification or white flight because of the riots, that actually people have been leaving for a decade beforehand. And
memories of Newark are a funny thing, because of course the typical white suburban narrative of Newark is Newark was this wonderful place. It was this nirvana, and then the riots hit, and then it went right downhill. And when you encounter somebody who tells you that story, you say, that's very interesting, sir. How do you know that? Well, I was born in Newark, they'll say. And you say, yes, and when did your family leave? And they say, 1959. Well, by 1967, a lot had changed. But of course, history and time conflates those things. You know, in the span of history, 1959 to 1967 is very small, but in the span of what was happening in Newark in that time, I mean, we're talking about a city that was really, really going downhill, such that on the eve of the riots in 1967, Newark was a deeply unhealthy city. I mean, it was #1 in the nation in rates of tuberculosis. It has one of the worst infant mortality rates. It has one of the highest poverty levels. It was not nirvana, but of course, the white suburban memory of it is nirvana. So that's very interesting. I oftentimes had the very uncomfortable conversation where I had to tell people that what they remember was not actually what they remember. Probably the hardest time doing that is interviewing law enforcement people and telling them that actually, according to historians who have really churned this event backwards and forwards, there was no such thing as snipers. There were no snipers in Newark. This is basically settled historic fact. And I myself went through the state police archives and looked through pages and pages and pages worth of individual reports filed by state troopers documenting thousands of man-hours spent looking for snipers. How many snipers did they actually find? None. Zero. Zip. You know, but you tell a policeman who was there, who says, I was shot at by snipers, that there were no snipers, and that's not going to fly with him, because who killed Fred Toto if it wasn't snipers? You know, I mean, and so it becomes a very emotional thing for them and very hard for them. And of course, then they'll start to really argue with you, and you say, no, because there was this cover of Life magazine. And you have to tell them that actually the cover of Life magazine that showed that picture with a sniper was posed in a studio. It did not take place in Newark. And I mean, so it can be very hard really peeling people's memory back and chipping at it a little bit and challenging them in a gentle way. But that actually, although, led to some of the most fascinating conversations I had about the riots. And I think that was to my advantage, was that I was so new to this, and that I was born in 1974, so this is all history to me, right? And I could say that to them. Hey, look, I wasn't there, I don't know, you please tell me. And then they start to tell me, and then you can kind of mix what they think they know with what actually happened. Yeah, so it's people's memories are a fascinating and fickle thing, and you can't mess with their memories, right? But I think, and maybe it's unique to people who are in their 60s and 70s, they've gotten so used to either forgetting things or being wrong about things that you can't actually tell them, no, it didn't happen quite the way you remembered it, and they're okay with that. I'm not sure you can tell that to somebody, 1 year after the fact or 5 years after the fact.
That's really interesting.
I don't know, yeah.
No, that's really interesting.
Random layman's thoughts on memory.
David Blight is actually somebody that has said, "Don't mess with my mom's memories."
Yeah.
It's a good quote.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk to me a little bit about that, how you handle that process as a reporter. So trying to balance oral history, right? Because we know that whether it's the myth of the black sniper, which we see come up in New Orleans for Katrina as well, there were no snipers there.
I reported on New Orleans.
Yeah. So we see the same kind of animalistic black male sexuality thing come up multiple times in these kinds of situations.
Are we gonna have to talk about Jack Johnson? What?
How do you balance oral history, right? And getting testimony from people? Because on one hand, we really, really need that, right? If it weren't for people taking oral history seriously, we wouldn't know a lot of the things that we know, because official history is written by the victors normally, right? So how do you balance the oral testimony that you receive from people as a journalist and historical fact? How do you tell someone, how do you balance those two things? Or when you're writing a piece on something, how do you, because maybe the way it was covered at the time was also wrong. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
We know
Unquestionably. Yeah, I mean, there were, and I cannot tell you, that was actually very interesting for me as a journalist, was to go back and look at contemporary accounts of what was going on with the benefit of 40 years worth of hindsight. Fascinating stuff, because it does remind you as a journalist, you are only as good as your sources. And if your sources are telling you something that's wrong, you've got no way of really, especially when it's breaking news and the blood of the city is boiling, and who has time to stop and fact check anything? Yeah, you're kind of at the mercy of the things that are being said. I think for me, and I don't know if this is even something that can be generalized, but it's hard work. You put in a lot of hard work. And I spent many months researching this stuff from all different angles. I mean, and talking to people on all sides. So not just talking to the victors, but talking to the losers, talking to the people who aren't sure whether they won or lost. And you come to get this trove of information, and therefore when somebody says something that isn't true, it kind of tugs on your ear a little bit. And so for me, I just didn't print that stuff. So I mean, it really is a, now this gets really heavy, but there's this sort of highfalutin idea that there's no such thing as the truth, that there's only stories told from different perspectives. But as a journalist, I came not to believe that at all. There is such thing as objective truth. The thing about it is it's very hard to come by, right? And you have to work really hard to get at it, and you have to talk to everybody you can think to talk to, and read everything you can think to read, and approach that information certainly without bias, and approach it honestly, and approach it without an agenda or a preconceived notion of what happened. But I really do think that if you drill through all of that stuff, you can really arrive at, hey, here's what happened here. And I think we at the Star-Ledger at the 40th anniversary did a really hard job at that, right? We really churned this thing up, and we really talked to people on all different sides. And so, we wrote this 4-part series about this hotly contested event in Newark history. And do you know how many phone calls we got complaining about it? None. because I think everybody realized we had given it our best effort, and that while they didn't necessarily agree with everything in there, they found stuff that they did agree with. And that the stuff that they didn't agree with, we had arrived at honestly. And they could at least say, well, I just don't happen to agree with that point of view. But that the kind of the total truth that we came up with was pretty good, I'd like to think. I don't know. But it's the hardest thing. I mean, you know, whether you're a journalist or an academic or an author, it's the stuff you leave out is at least as wrenching as the stuff you put in, and isn't that the truth? So yeah, and what's the calculus of what you leave out and what you put in? I don't know. You know, I guess for me it was like I had only so many words and so many inches of newsprint, and so the stuff that I put in there had better be right.
What did you come across while researching the summer of '67 that surprised you that you hadn't seen before?
Right. I guess what surprised me the most was how raw this event was to people in so many ways, and how emotional it was to them. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times in an interview where somebody I was speaking with actually broke down or got choked up. You know, I think it was this thing that they had sort of put in this little box in their brain, and it was in a safe place, but then the moment they opened the box, all these emotions and all these feelings would come rushing back, and they felt a lot of different things. Maybe they felt some guilt over something they had done or something they hadn't done, or maybe they felt sadness about what happened. But I mean, here it is, I'm talking to them about something that was 40 years ago, this is history, but the feelings it could invoke were still very fresh, even 40 years later. And so yeah, and it didn't matter who I was talking to. Cops would get choked up thinking about their fellow cops who they were there with, or people who worked in City Hall thinking about the decisions they made or didn't make, or protesters who were out on the front lines thinking about, like, maybe did their actions lead to this in some way? And I think they were also, over the course of 40 years, if maybe originally during the event they had said, okay, that guy's to blame, he's clearly all at fault, 40 years later, they had more turned the lens on themselves, and they were willing to say, okay, that guy was to blame, but what did I contribute to this? What am I to blame for? And those kind of thoughts could, like I said, were just very real and very raw and very emotional, and the passing of 40 years didn't matter at all to the realness of those emotions.
What did you find most challenging in trying to commemorate on the 40th anniversary?
I think the great challenge was to make sure that we weren't just talking to the same voices that had been talking about the riot for 40 years. Because I think there had been a small piece of Newark that had wanted to keep talking about the riots, and had almost kind of gotten to tell this story because they had been the only ones talking. And you know, the old cliche, history is written by the victors. Well, if you didn't talk to people on all sides, you were going to get this history written by this very small subset of people. So I think the challenge was to make sure that we did include everyone. And for me as a journalist, that I did talk to, guess what? The National Guardsmen, right? Now, according to some people's view of what happened in the riots, the National Guardsman is the bad guy, right? Because he's the one who came in and shot up the place. Well, but now let's talk to the National Guardsmen. And I talked to a bunch of them. And let's learn that really, they were just scared kids from Hunterdon County. And I'm sorry, if you're 20, 21, 22 years old, you're a kid. I don't care if the U.S. military has put a helmet on your hands and an M16 in your hands. You're still a kid. And by the way, you're a kid who's been told to be scared of Newark, right? And so, like, get their perspective of how terrified they were to be brought in. And by the way, they're not soldiers. They're weekend warriors. They were just happy to not be in Vietnam, and all of a sudden they're getting sent to Newark. You know, so being able to talk to, say, a National Guardsman, or a cop, or a firefighter, or the people who hadn't typically gotten to tell their story, I think was probably the most important thing that we could do, and also the greatest challenge, because to a certain extent they had been vilified. You know, and so talking to a state trooper, again, another group whose role has been loudly questioned over the years, and maybe they've been told, oh, you did a bad thing, but you know what, you're talking to them, and it's like, hey, they were just trying to do their best. You know, they were being brought into an area that they maybe didn't know that well because it wasn't their normal patrol, and they were working these insane shifts. You know, so they were grabbing 3 hours of sleep and then going right back out. And you know, it was hard for them, but it was also a job that they were approaching with a sense of professionalism, and they were trying to apply that professionalism. You know, so you get that kind of story, and I guess so that was really the big challenge, is making sure every voice of every person who was in this event is somehow represented.
You mentioned for our previous question that a small group of people continued to want to tell this narrative, and they were the only people that are really voicing this narrative. Who was that group? Which narrative?
Yes, who was that group? I know exactly who they are. Can I describe who they are? There definitely was a group of activists in Newark for whom being able to talk about the disturbance and being able to bring up the disturbance was, whether it was politically convenient for them or whether it was a great way to get extra funding for Newark or what have you. I mean, the riot became something they used to a certain extent. I mean, and certainly when you look at the sea change that happened in Newark politics after the riots, I mean, a whole generation of Newark politicians owed their careers to the civil disturbance of 1967, and make no mistake about it. So I think for some of them, being able to mention the riots or bring up the riots or use the riots as one of those touchstones had some expedience to it. So it was politicians, it was activists. Now, mind you, they're not really unpacking and exploring this event. They're kind of using it as just a convenient reference point, I guess. And like I said, to get leverage for certain things. I mean, and I don't mean to say that they're doing this in some sneaky, conniving way, but look, that's what they had, and that's what they had to talk about, and that's what had happened to their city. So I think definitely there were some activist groups and some political groups that needed to kind of keep the riots alive a little bit.
Did you attend any of the commemorative events in 2007? The Newark Museum had things going on.
Oh, yeah.
The New Jersey Historical Society pretty much went broke over that exhibit. Because Rutgers and NJT and
not even. Oh no! Like when you say pretty much went broke, they didn't. They did go broke.
They went broke, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's very sad.
I learned from Max Herman how much it took to mount that exhibit.
Yeah.
As a multimedia exhibit.
Yeah.
And that Rutgers and NJT and other places pulled money. They had pledged money, and then last minute were like,
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I do remember hearing that rumor that all of a sudden, like, they were looking for change in the couches at the New Jersey Historical Society, but I didn't realize it was specifically.
But it's interesting if people pledge money to you.
Yeah, that's bad.
And then they're like, no,
well,
just
Prudential
kidding.
was supposed to give them a lot of money for that. Did they?
And then they gave them like half.
Oh,
Prudential's big, right?
Oh yeah, they're
a little bit.
Just a bit. So yes, I went to every single commemorative event. I went to, I mean, everything I could reasonably do.
Great.
I went to.
Tell me about it. So for people that were not in Newark in 2007,
right?
What did this citywide commemoration look like? It was many cultural institutions, right? Religious centers. What did it look like? Who attended? Who were these things put on for? What did the exhibits look like? What kinds of pieces were shown? And what do you think was the overall agenda? As loudly as you can.
Yeah. I think everybody got a little piece of the 40th anniversary. When you look at Newark, the arts community certainly seized on it, and we had a number of different events. You know, whether it was an oral presentation, whether it was visual arts, certainly, the New Jersey Historical Society did a lot with it, the museum did a lot with it, the library did things with it. What I would like, and certainly the Newark Star-Ledger did a lot with it. I would like to think that we did engage a piece of the citizenry that had not been engaged in this subject before, and that anybody who had some bit of interest in this event was going to learn a whole lot new. You know, and I I think about all the events I went to and the incredible cross-section of people that I saw. I mean, I think we really did do a credible job of reaching out to as many people as possible. I mean, I'm thinking back to some of these events I went to.
Man, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
There was a part of me that was like, oh, maybe it's because we're next to the police station. It's not.
No, we're just in Newark.
Anywhere.
When I think about the people who were attending these events, I'm flashing back in my mind to people wearing dashikis and people who were from Livingston and people who grew up in Newark and people who had barely ever stepped foot in Newark. I mean, I think the commemoration really was aimed at a broad swath of people, and I'd like to think it hit a broad swath of people. You know, it really, when you think about Newark and the diversity of this city, that it has been said many times, Rutgers Newark has the most diverse student population in the country, and I think that was reflected very much in the commemoration of, we really did get a broad cross-section of just very different kind of folks, socioeconomically, culturally, politically, religiously. You know, I'd like to think we included everyone.
What did these exhibits look like? What kinds of things were put to view? Different mediums? What could somebody see that day? Yeah,
I mean, I think there were numerous showings of Revolution '67, the film, put together by the Bongiornos. I certainly remember some panel discussions, both before, during, and after, where we brought in everybody from Oliver Lofton to well, I'm not sure you had to bring in Oliver because he's just right down the road, but you know, I think that a lot of the people who had made this history were given a chance to have a voice into it. Actually, the very first event that I went to was there was a republishing of No Cause for Indictment, which was Ron Parambo's seminal work on the Newark riots, and they put that book out about 6 months ahead of when the actual anniversary was, and there was a panel on that, and there were a number of people who gathered for that, and I believe it was broadcast on television. I think that kind of kicked off the commemoration season, if you will, and then everybody who was on the Big Bad Committee, I think, had some kind of event scheduled or opened their space for the use of the Newark riot in some way. I do remember putting together a brochure because we wanted to make sure that this wasn't just all being scattered in the wind, you know. And this brochure ended up being, I believe, a legal size paper folded, and we ended up having to make about like 7-point font because there was so much stuff going on and so much stuff to say that, and you wanted to get to it all, that it ended up being really quite an impressive, if not exhausting, document.
Very interesting. What is your hope for the 50th anniversary? What do you hope to see in the city? How do you think people at 50 years removed from the event are going to maybe remember, reflect on it? What kinds of public forms of commemoration? I know that the first time I tried to find the marker itself, the cement marker that has people's names, I drove by it at least 3 times, and I couldn't find it.
You're better than me. I drove by that marker at least 10 times. And actually, it was more like, I used to live in Maplewood, and if ever I heard 78 was clogged, or even if I just thought it would be, I would drive down Springfield Avenue, because I lived right off Springfield Avenue, and so I would drive down Springfield. I cannot tell you the number of times I passed that monument, and somebody finally said to me, "Hey, well, it's like that riot marker on Springfield Avenue," and I said, "Huh?" I mean, by that point, I had probably driven by that marker 1,000 times and had not seen it once. So yeah, that marker is not exactly what I would call in the most public of places or accessible of places. But yeah, that's another, the 50th. Certainly one of my hopes for the 50th, or at least for some point in the future, has to do with this building I'm standing next to, the 4th Precinct. It's of course still being used as an operating police precinct, but I know there are thoughts or plans afoot, or there have been, to mothball it because it's a rather defunct building. I think there would be no more appropriate place to have some kind of permanent exhibit to the civil disturbance than this building. And I certainly hope, if ever this building becomes available, that the city of Newark will make it be able to be used for that purpose, because here it is, you know, and let's not knock this building down. I mean, this building for Newark, it's Newark's Iwo Jima, it's Newark's Mount Rushmore, it's Newark's, I mean, it is such an incredibly meaningful building within the history of this city, and it ought to be preserved. So certainly I hope that's something that happens. I guess I hope people can continue to work to understand this event. Because if there's one thing I learned about reporting the Newark riots, and I talked to hundreds of people and read hundreds of documents, is that for whatever stories had been told, there were no bad guys. There really weren't. There were people who were trying to do the best with the constraints that they had, or in the role they thought they were supposed to play. And yeah, things got out of control, and people on all sides did things they later regretted, but it didn't make them bad people. And I hope that we can come to see really the essential humanity of the people who were involved in this cataclysmic event, and understand why they did the things they did, and maybe forgive them for it. That's a lot to ask, I know, but everybody, I think, not everybody, but many of the people I talked to felt they had done some things wrong, and felt they had done some things they were maybe ashamed of. And maybe 50 years later we can say, you know what, you did your best, it's okay, we forgive you.